The heavy steel door clanged shut, a sound that echoed through the concrete corridors and into the deepest corners of a man's soul. For some, it was a death knell, for others, a temporary inconvenience. For Fingers, it was the soundtrack to his existence. Sunrise in Ironwood Penitentiary was a symphony of misery. The groan of rusty hinges as cell doors slid open, the shouts of guards, the shuffling of feet as inmates trudged to the mess hall. The smell of stale bread and lukewarm coffee hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of their confinement. Fingers, so nicknamed for his uncanny dexterity and nimble hands, was a study in contrasts. He was slight of build, almost wiry, but possessed a sharp intelligence that gleamed in his eyes. Unlike many of the inmates who wore their anger and resentment on their sleeves, Fingers kept his emotions carefully guarded. He observed, he listened, he planned. His cell was small, barely enough room for a bunk and a metal toilet. But Fingers had transformed it into his own little world. He kept it meticulously clean, the few personal belongings he had neatly arranged. A worn-out book lay on his bunk, its pages filled with notes and diagrams. It was his escape, his window to the outside world. Life in Ironwood was monotonous, a relentless cycle of meals, work details, and lockups. But Fingers had learned to find patterns in the chaos, to see the cracks in the system. He knew the guards' routines, the blind spots in the security cameras, the whispers that traveled through the prison grapevine. He worked in the laundry, a hot and steamy place filled with the constant drone of washing machines. It was a mindless task, but it gave him access to clean uniforms, sheets, and, most importantly, time to think. He'd fold shirts, his mind racing, piecing together his plan. The laundry room was near the administrative offices. He could hear the clatter of keyboards and the muffled voices of the staff. He paid close attention to the sounds, trying to glean any information that might be useful. He was patient. He was meticulous. And he was determined to escape. Ironwood Penitentiary might hold his body, but it would never hold his mind. Fingers wasn't just seeing, he was observing. It was more than just knowing the guard at Tower C always took his coffee black, it was knowing he always checked his watch at precisely 3:17 p.m., a habit ingrained after years on the job. It was knowing that during the Tuesday shift change, there was a 5-minute window where the hallway outside the admin office was virtually unguarded. He saw the way the sunlight glinted off the warden's bald head during his morning walks, a path that always took him past the loading dock, never the east wing. He understood that the kitchen staff always left the back door unlocked during deliveries, a minor infraction that could become a major opportunity. His mind was a complex algorithm, constantly processing data, identifying weaknesses in the prison's seemingly impenetrable defenses. The guard rotations were predictable, a carefully choreographed dance that repeated every week. The new recruits were easily flustered, their inexperience a glaring vulnerability. Even the seasoned veterans had their blind spots, moments of complacency that Fingers catalogued with meticulous precision. The admin office was his primary focus. He noticed the flimsy lock on the supply closet, the overflowing wastepaper baskets filled with discarded memos and forms. He saw the way the secretaries gossiped freely, often leaving sensitive documents unattended on their desks. He learned their lunch schedules, their coffee breaks, their personal habits. He paid particular attention to Mrs. Henderson, the head secretary. She was a creature of habit, arriving at 7 a.m. sharp, meticulously organizing her desk before settling in for the day. She always took a 15-minute break at 10 a.m., leaving her office unattended. He noticed she struggled with the old photocopier, often leaving it jammed with paper. These small details, seemingly insignificant, were pieces of the puzzle, elements he could use to his advantage. The sounds of the office became familiar, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the whirring of the photocopier, the murmur of conversations. He imagined the layout, the location of the filing cabinets, the position of the security cameras. He visualized himself inside, navigating the maze of desks and cubicles, searching for what he needed. He saw the guard assigned to the admin office was fond of crossword puzzles. Every afternoon, he'd be engrossed, oblivious to his surroundings, except for the occasional sip of lukewarm coffee. Fingers smiled inwardly. Every detail was a thread, and he was slowly weaving them together into a rope that would pull him to freedom. The realization hit Fingers like a jolt of electricity. It wasn't a sudden flash of insight, but a slow, creeping understanding that solidified over weeks of careful observation. The admin office, the supposed nerve center of Ironwood, was surprisingly vulnerable. He'd initially dismissed it as too risky, too heavily guarded. But the more he watched, the more he saw the cracks in its facade. The supply closet, supposedly locked, was secured with a flimsy padlock that looked more decorative than functional. He'd seen Mrs. Henderson struggle with the key on multiple occasions, often leaving the door slightly ajar in her frustration. One afternoon, while collecting laundry from the admin office, Fingers overheard a conversation between two secretaries. They were complaining about the new ink cartridges, how expensive they were and how the warden was always on their case about conserving supplies. "It's not like we're printing money," one of them had grumbled. "Although, with all these release forms, you'd think we were running a lottery." Release forms. The words echoed in Fingers' mind. He knew, of course, that the admin office handled inmate release paperwork. But the casual way the secretary had mentioned it suggested a certain carelessness, a lack of awareness about the importance of those documents. He started paying closer attention to the wastepaper baskets, sifting through discarded memos and forms during his laundry rounds. He found crumpled release forms with minor errors, forms that had been voided and thrown away. He noticed the official stamps, the warden's signature, the embossed seal of the prison. Then, one day, he struck gold. Tucked beneath a pile of shredded documents, he found a nearly pristine blank release form. It was a template, a master copy used to create all the other forms. He carefully smoothed it out, his heart pounding in his chest. He also confirmed his suspicion about the ink. The admin office used a specific type of ink for official documents, a deep, rich blue that was difficult to replicate. He saw the cartridges stored in the supply closet, easily accessible. The pieces were falling into place. He knew he needed the templates, the ink, and the stamps. The lax security of the admin office, combined with his own meticulous planning, presented an opportunity he couldn't ignore. The rope to freedom was getting thicker, stronger. He just needed to find a way to grab hold. With the blank template secured and the ink identified, Fingers shifted his focus to the next crucial step, understanding the precise procedures for inmate release. He couldn't simply forge a document, he needed to create a flawless replica that would withstand scrutiny. This meant knowing every detail, from the specific wording used on the forms to the order in which they were processed. He started by observing inmates being released. He'd position himself near the sally port, watching as they went through the final stages of processing. He noted the questions the guards asked, the documents they checked, the stamps they applied. He paid attention to the body language of the inmates, trying to gauge their level of nervousness or confidence. He befriended a few inmates who were nearing their release dates, carefully probing them for information about the release process. He'd ask seemingly innocuous questions, like, "What kind of ID did they ask for?" or "Did they check your fingerprints again at the gate?" He was careful not to arouse suspicion, framing his inquiries as idle curiosity. He learned that inmates were typically given a small amount of money upon release, a gate fee, to help them get started on the outside. He found out how much it was, and how it was distributed. He also discovered that inmates were given a bus ticket to the nearest city, a detail he knew he would have to replicate on his forged documents. He spent hours in the prison library, poring over legal manuals and procedural guidelines. He searched for any information he could find about inmate release procedures, memorizing regulations and protocols. He knew that the more he knew, the better his chances of success. He discovered that the release forms required multiple signatures, including the warden's, the head of securities, and the releasing officers. He needed to find a way to replicate those signatures convincingly. He also learned about the importance of the embossed seal, a unique identifier that authenticated the document. Fingers meticulously compiled all the information he gathered, creating a detailed checklist of every step in the release process. He knew that even the smallest mistake could expose his forgery and land him back in his cell, or worse. He was playing a dangerous game, but the reward, freedom, was worth the risk. He had his rope, and now he was learning how to climb it. The night was Fingers' ally. The prison, usually a cacophony of noise, settled into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the occasional cough or snore. He waited for the 3 a.m. guard, the one with the heavy foot and the predictable route. He knew the exact moment the guard would pass his cell, the creak in the floorboards a telltale sign. He'd disabled the light in his cell weeks ago, claiming it was broken. The guards hadn't bothered to fix it, leaving his corner of the block shrouded in darkness. This gave him a distinct advantage. He'd loosened the bars on his cell window over time, using a sharpened spoon he'd smuggled from the mess hall. It was slow, tedious work, but he'd managed to create just enough space to squeeze through. Tonight was the night. He slipped through the bars, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was deserted, the only light coming from the dim bulbs at either end. He moved quickly and silently, hugging the shadows. He reached the laundry room undetected. From there, he could access the hallway leading to the admin office. He knew this was the most dangerous part of the mission. The hallway was monitored by security cameras, and there was always a chance of encountering a guard. He waited, listening intently for any signs of activity. He heard the distant sound of a television, probably coming from the guard station. He took a deep breath and darted across the hallway, pressing himself against the wall outside the admin office. He jiggled the handle of the supply closet door. It was unlocked, just as he suspected. He slipped inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He could smell the faint odor of ink and paper. He located the ink cartridges easily, stacked neatly on a shelf. He grabbed a few, stuffing them into his pockets. He knew he couldn't take too much, he didn't want to arouse suspicion. Finding the release form templates proved more challenging. He rummaged through the shelves, his fingers brushing against stacks of paper and folders. He was starting to get nervous. He knew he didn't have much time. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. He froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He ducked behind a stack of boxes, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped outside the door. He heard the jingle of keys. Someone was trying to open the door. He braced himself, ready to fight. But then, the footsteps moved on. The keys jingled again, and he heard the sound of a door opening down the hall. He let out a sigh of relief. He quickly resumed his search, his hands trembling. Finally, he found them, a stack of blank release form templates, hidden beneath a pile of old manuals. He grabbed them, stuffing them into his shirt. He slipped out of the supply closet, his heart still racing. He retraced his steps, moving quickly and silently. He made it back to his cell undetected. He squeezed back through the bars, carefully replacing them. He lay on his bunk, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had the ink and the templates. The rope to freedom was almost complete. Back in his cell, Fingers began the painstaking process of perfecting his forgery. He knew that the slightest imperfection could raise suspicion and ruin everything. He had to become a master counterfeiter, replicating the official documents with flawless precision. He started with the handwriting. He had managed to memorize the handwriting of the warden, the head of security, and the releasing officer by studying discarded memos and forms. He practiced their signatures endlessly, using a sharpened pencil as a makeshift pen. He'd fill scraps of paper with loops and swirls, trying to mimic the unique style of each signature. He noticed that the warden's signature had a distinctive flourish, a small loop at the end of the W that was almost imperceptible. The head of security's signature was more angular, with sharp, precise lines. The releasing officer's signature was hurried and sloppy, as if he couldn't wait to get the paperwork over with. He practiced each signature hundreds of times, until he could reproduce them perfectly from memory. He knew that muscle memory was key. He wanted his hand to move instinctively, replicating the signatures without conscious thought. Replicating the official stamps was an even greater challenge. He couldn't steal the actual stamps, so he had to improvise. He used a piece of rubber from an old shoe sole and a sharpened nail to carve out a replica of the prison seal. It was a crude approximation, but it was the best he could do with the resources available to him. He also needed to replicate the date stamp and the releasing officer's initials. He used small pieces of wood and melted plastic to create miniature stamps. He experimented with different inks, trying to match the color and consistency of the official ink. He practiced stamping the forms over and over again, carefully positioning the stamps to match the placement on the real documents. He learned how much pressure to apply to create a clear, crisp impression. He used tea bags to stain the paper, giving it an aged, authentic look. He knew that the details mattered. The more authentic the documents looked, the more likely he was to fool the guards at the gate. He spent hours hunched over his bunk, working in the dim light. His eyes ached, his hands were cramped, but he refused to stop. He was driven by a burning desire for freedom, a determination to escape the confines of Ironwood Penitentiary. He practiced, and practiced, and practiced, until his forgeries were indistinguishable from the real thing. He was ready. The rope to freedom was complete. All that remained was to climb it. Fingers knew that timing was everything. He couldn't simply walk up to the gate and present his forged documents. He needed to wait for the perfect opportunity, a moment when the odds were stacked in his favor. He started paying close attention to the guard schedule, memorizing the names and faces of the guards assigned to the front gate. He knew that some guards were more diligent than others, more likely to scrutinize the paperwork. He needed to avoid those guards at all costs. He was looking for someone new, someone inexperienced, someone who wouldn't know the proper procedures inside and out. A rookie, fresh out of training, eager to impress but easily intimidated. He learned that new guards were often assigned to the gate on Mondays, the start of the week. He also noticed that there was a higher turnover rate among the gate guards, as it was considered a less desirable post. He waited patiently, biding his time. Days turned into weeks, but fingers refused to rush. He knew that one wrong move could jeopardize everything. He continued to study the guard schedule, watching for the perfect opportunity. Then, one Monday morning, he saw it. A new name on the schedule, Guard Miller. He'd never seen him before. He asked around, discreetly inquiring about the new guard. He learned that Miller was fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself. He was also said to be a bit nervous, easily flustered under pressure. This was it. This was his moment. Fingers spent the rest of the day preparing. He double-checked his forged documents, making sure every detail was perfect. He practiced his story, rehearsing what he would say to the guard. He tried to appear calm and confident, despite the knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. He knew that he had to project an air of authority, to make the guard believe that he was legitimately being released. He couldn't afford to show any sign of nervousness or doubt. That evening, as the sun began to set, Fingers felt a surge of adrenaline. He was ready. The rope to freedom was in his hand. He just needed to climb it one last time. Tomorrow was the day. He would walk out of Ironwood Penitentiary a free man. He just needed to fool Guard Miller. He hoped he was up to the task. His life depended on it. The morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the storm brewing inside Fingers. Today was the day. He had to remain calm, focused. He ate his breakfast slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his stomach. Back in his cell, he laid out his materials, the blank release form, the stolen ink cartridges, the makeshift stamps, the sharpened pencil. He took a deep breath and began. He started by filling in the personal information, his name, his inmate number, his date of birth. He used his most formal handwriting, making sure each letter was clear and legible. He had to appear legitimate, someone worthy of release. Then came the more challenging parts, the warden's signature, the head of security's signature, the releasing officer's signature. He took his time, carefully replicating each signature from memory. He held his breath as he made each stroke, his hand trembling slightly. He knew that the slightest mistake could ruin everything. One wrong loop, one misplaced line, and the entire document would be compromised. He had to be perfect. He dipped his makeshift stamps into the stolen ink, carefully positioning them on the form. He pressed down firmly, creating a clear, crisp impression. He checked the placement against the real release forms he had studied, making sure everything was aligned correctly. He added the embossed seal, pressing it firmly into the paper. He used a small amount of water to dampen the paper first, creating a more defined impression. He filled in the date of release, making it today's date. He added the details about the gate fee and the bus ticket, making sure the amounts were accurate. He checked and rechecked the document, scrutinizing every detail. He compared it to the checklist he had created, making sure he hadn't missed anything. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his forehead. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. He was almost finished. He took one last look at the document. It was perfect. It was a flawless replica of an official release form. It was his ticket to freedom. He carefully folded the document and tucked it inside his shirt. He stood up, his legs feeling weak. He took another deep breath and walked out of his cell, ready to face Guard Miller. The rope to freedom was in his pocket. It was time to climb. The air crackled with anticipation. This was it. The walk to the front gate felt like an eternity. Every step was measured, deliberate. Fingers focused on maintaining a steady pace, avoiding any hint of nervousness or haste. He had to project an air of confidence, as if he had every right to be walking towards freedom. He passed other inmates, some of whom stared at him with a mixture of envy and curiosity. He ignored them, keeping his eyes fixed on the gate ahead. He could feel the weight of the forged documents pressing against his chest, a constant reminder of the risk he was taking. He reached the sally port, the final checkpoint before the gate. A guard waved him through, barely glancing at his face. Fingers breathed a sigh of relief. One hurdle down, one more to go. He approached the gate, where Guard Miller stood fidgeting nervously. He was younger than Fingers had expected, with a clean-shaven face and wide, anxious eyes. He looked like he was about to burst out of his uniform. Fingers stopped a few feet away from the gate, maintaining a respectful distance. He took a deep breath and pulled the forged documents from his shirt. He handed them to Guard Miller with a steady hand. "Here are my release papers," he said, his voice calm and confident. "I'm being released today." Guard Miller took the documents, his hands trembling slightly. He began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. Fingers watched him carefully, studying his every move. Miller scanned the documents, his eyes darting back and forth. He checked the name, the inmate number, the date of release. He seemed to be comparing the information to something on his clipboard. Fingers could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was the critical moment. If Miller spotted any inconsistencies, any signs of forgery, it would all be over. Miller hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning over the signatures. He seemed unsure, uncertain. Fingers held his breath, waiting for his decision. Finally, Miller looked up, his eyes meeting Fingers. He cleared his throat. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Just a few routine questions." Fingers nodded, relieved. He had cleared the first hurdle. Now he just had to answer the questions convincingly. The rope to freedom was within reach. He just had to climb it one last time. He could almost taste the fresh air of freedom. "Name?" Guard Miller asked, his voice still shaky. "Robert Johnson," Fingers replied, using the alias he had carefully prepared. "Inmate number?" 34972. "Reason for release?" "Parole," Fingers answered, keeping his voice steady. He knew that parole was a common reason for release, less likely to raise suspicion than a full exoneration. Miller scribbled something on his clipboard. He hesitated for a moment, then looked up at Fingers again. "Do you have any questions about your release?" Fingers shook his head. "No, sir. Everything is clear." Miller nodded, seemingly satisfied. He stamped the release papers with a final seal and handed them back to Fingers. "You're free to go, Mr. Johnson." Fingers took the papers, his hand trembling slightly. He could hardly believe it. He was actually going to walk out of here. He turned and walked towards the gate, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel Miller's eyes on his back, watching his every move. He forced himself to maintain a steady pace, avoiding any hint of triumph or excitement. He reached the gate and pushed it open, stepping out into the sunlight. He took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. It was sweeter than anything he had ever tasted. He was free. He walked away from the prison, his pace quickening with each step. He didn't look back. He knew that he couldn't afford to waste any time. He had to get as far away from Ironwood as possible. He reached the main road and flagged down a passing bus. He paid his fare and took a seat near the back, blending in with the other passengers. He watched the prison recede into the distance, a dark and forbidding silhouette against the horizon. He was gone. He had done it. He had climbed the rope to freedom and made it to the other side. He looked out the window, watching the world go by. It was a world he hadn't seen in years, a world that had changed in his absence. He had a lot of catching up to do. He was a free man, but he was also a fugitive. He knew that the authorities would be looking for him. He had to be careful, resourceful. He had to disappear. He had a plan. He had always had a plan. And now, he was finally in a position to put it into action. The world was his oyster. The possibilities were endless. He was free. He was finally free. Back at Ironwood, the initial sense of routine soon shattered. It wasn't Guard Miller who discovered the deception. He was still basking in the accomplishment of his first solo gate duty, blissfully unaware that he'd just sprung a hardened criminal. It was Mrs. Henderson, the head secretary, who first noticed something was amiss. She was preparing the end-of-day release reports, cross-referencing the gate log with the official release documents. When she couldn't find Robert Johnson's file, a cold dread washed over her. She frantically searched through the filing cabinets, her heart pounding in her chest. The file was nowhere to be found. She checked the computer system, but there was no record of a Robert Johnson being released that day. She immediately alerted the head of security, a burly man named Captain Reynolds. He arrived at her office, his face grim. Mrs. Henderson explained the situation, her voice trembling with fear. Reynolds immediately launched an investigation. He reviewed the security footage from the front gate, but it showed nothing suspicious. He questioned Guard Miller, who insisted that he had followed all the proper procedures. Reynolds then ordered a thorough audit of the release documents. They quickly discovered that the release form Miller had accepted was a forgery. The signatures were expertly crafted, but they were slightly off. The embossed seal was a fake. The paper was a different grade than the official forms. The alarm was raised. A lockdown was ordered. Guards swarmed the prison, searching every cell, every corner. They knew that Fingers was long gone, but they had to make sure he hadn't left behind any accomplices. Reynolds was furious. He couldn't believe that he had been outsmarted by an inmate. He vowed to catch Fingers and bring him back to Ironwood, where he would pay dearly for his audacity. The warden was informed, and he was livid. He knew that this escape would damage the prison's reputation. He demanded a full investigation, vowing to find out how Fingers had managed to pull off such an elaborate scheme. Heads would roll. The prison erupted in chaos. The inmates were on edge, sensing the tension in the air. The guards were on high alert, their nerves frayed. The news of Fingers' escape spread like wildfire, fueling rumors and speculation. Fingers was gone, but his actions had left a mark on Ironwood Penitentiary. The prison would never be the same. The system had been breached. The illusion of control had been shattered. And somewhere out there, Fingers was enjoying his newfound freedom. But for how long? The moment the warden authorized it, the manhunt for Fingers went into full swing. The local police were alerted first, followed by state troopers and even the FBI, given the audacious nature of the escape and the potential for Fingers to cross state lines. A description of Fingers, along with his alias, Robert Johnson, was broadcast on every news channel and radio station. His picture, taken from his prison mugshot, flashed across television screens, his eyes seeming to mock the viewers. "Escaped inmate, armed and dangerous," the captions screamed. Even though Fingers wasn't necessarily armed, the dangerous part sold newspapers and ensured quicker responses. Roadblocks were set up on all major highways leading away from Ironwood. Every car was stopped, every driver questioned. Police officers scrutinized faces, comparing them to the picture on the wanted poster. The bus Fingers had boarded was quickly identified, and police raced to intercept it. But when they finally pulled it over, Fingers was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, leaving no trace. The authorities were baffled. How could he have disappeared so quickly? Had he had help? Was he still in the area? The manhunt expanded, encompassing a wider and wider area. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their spotlights cutting through the night sky. Police dogs sniffed around bus stations and train depots, searching for Fingers' scent. Captain Reynolds, consumed by his desire to recapture Fingers, personally oversaw the operation. He worked tirelessly, reviewing every piece of evidence, interviewing every witness. He was determined to bring Fingers to justice, no matter what it took. He put pressure on Fingers' known associates, hoping to squeeze information out of them. He offered rewards for any tips leading to Fingers' capture. He even contacted Fingers' family, appealing to their sense of civic duty. The media frenzy surrounding the escape intensified. Newspapers ran daily updates, speculating on Fingers' whereabouts and motives. Talk shows debated the security flaws at Ironwood Penitentiary, questioning the competence of the prison officials. Fingers had become a folk hero, a symbol of defiance against the system. Some people cheered his escape, seeing him as a clever underdog who had outsmarted the authorities. Others condemned him as a dangerous criminal who deserved to be punished. But regardless of public opinion, one thing was certain: the manhunt for Fingers was on, and it was relentless. The police were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they caught him. Or so they thought. Fingers had a few tricks up his sleeve still. Fingers had planned his escape meticulously, but staying free was a different ballgame altogether. He knew the authorities would be relentless, and he had to use all his wits and street smarts to stay one step ahead. His first move after getting off the bus was to ditch the Robert Johnson alias. He knew that name would be plastered everywhere, and he couldn't risk being recognized. He found a secluded spot behind a gas station and changed his clothes, discarding the prison-issued garb for a set of worn-out jeans and a t-shirt he had stashed in a backpack. He also shaved off his prison regulation haircut, transforming his appearance. He avoided major cities and highways, sticking to back roads and small towns. He traveled by hitchhiking and hopping freight trains, relying on the kindness of strangers and his ability to blend in. He knew that money would be a problem. The gate fee he had received upon release was barely enough to cover his basic needs. He couldn't get a legitimate job without raising suspicion, so he had to resort to petty theft and scams to survive. He learned to pickpocket, targeting tourists and unsuspecting shoppers. He used his nimble fingers to lift wallets and jewelry, always careful to avoid getting caught. He also ran small cons, selling fake merchandise and promising services he couldn't deliver. He slept in abandoned buildings, under bridges, and in homeless shelters, always keeping one eye open. He knew that he couldn't trust anyone. The world was full of informants and bounty hunters, eager to turn him in for the reward money. He relied on his instincts, trusting his gut feelings to guide him. If a situation felt wrong, he would immediately leave, never taking any chances. He kept a low profile, avoiding contact with other people as much as possible. He knew that the more he interacted with others, the greater the risk of being recognized. He followed the news closely, monitoring the progress of the manhunt. He learned that the authorities were focusing their search on the areas surrounding Ironwood Penitentiary. He decided to head west, hoping to lose them in the vastness of the American landscape. He knew that his freedom was temporary. Eventually, the police would catch up to him. But he was determined to make the most of his time on the run, to experience the world outside of prison walls. He had tasted freedom, and he wasn't about to give it up easily. He was a ghost, a shadow, a whisper in the wind. He was Fingers, and he was on the run. Fingers had been hitchhiking for 3 days, heading west, when he ran into a close call that made his blood run cold. He was riding in the back of a pickup truck with 2 other drifters, sharing stories and swigs from a bottle of cheap whiskey. They were driving through a small town in Nevada when they were pulled over by a police car. The officer said it was a routine check, but Fingers knew better. He could feel the tension in the air, the officer's eyes scanning them suspiciously. The officer asked for identification. Fingers' companions readily produced their driver's licenses, but Fingers knew he couldn't risk showing any ID. He didn't have any fake documents, and his real identity would immediately flag him as an escaped convict. He pretended to search his pockets, his heart pounding in his chest. "I must have lost my wallet," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't have any ID on me." The officer eyed him suspiciously. "What's your name?" he asked. Fingers hesitated for a moment, trying to come up with a convincing alias. He couldn't use Robert Johnson again, that name would be flagged in the system. "Michael Smith," he said finally, hoping it sounded believable. The officer wrote down the name on his notepad. "Date of birth?" Fingers quickly calculated a plausible date of birth, trying to remember how old he was supposed to be. He rattled off a random date, hoping it wouldn't raise any red flags. The officer went back to his patrol car and ran the names through his computer. Fingers waited, his palms sweating. He knew that it was only a matter of time before the officer discovered his true identity. He considered making a run for it, but he knew that it would be suicide. The officer was armed, and he had backup on the way. He had to think fast. The officer came back, his face grim. "Michael Smith," he said, "step out of the truck." Fingers obeyed, his legs feeling weak. He knew that this was it. He was about to be caught. The officer patted him down, searching for weapons. Fingers remained calm, trying to control his breathing. He knew that any sign of panic would give him away. The officer found nothing. He stepped back, his eyes still fixed on Fingers. "We've been getting reports of an escaped convict in the area," he said. "You fit the description." Fingers swallowed hard. He knew that the officer was onto him. He had to do something, anything, to avoid being arrested. Suddenly, he saw his chance. A car sped past, blaring its horn. The officer turned his head for a split second. It was all the time Fingers needed. He bolted. He sprinted across the road, dodging traffic, heading for the woods on the other side. He could hear the officer shouting behind him, but he didn't look back. He ran as fast as he could, his lungs burning, his legs aching. He reached the woods and plunged into the undergrowth, disappearing into the shadows. He could hear the police sirens wailing in the distance, but he knew that he had made it. He had evaded capture, at least for now. He was still free. But he knew that he couldn't stay in the area. He had to keep moving, keep running, keep staying one step ahead of the authorities. The chase was far from over. The close call with the police had shaken Fingers to his core. He realized that he couldn't keep running forever. He needed help, resources, a safe place to lay low. He thought back to his life before Ironwood, to the people he knew, the connections he had made. There was one person he could trust, or at least, he hoped he could trust, a former associate named Razor Ray. Ray was a small-time crook, a hustler who knew the ins and outs of the criminal underworld. Fingers and Ray had pulled off a few scams together back in the day, and they had always looked out for each other. Fingers knew that contacting Ray was a risk. Ray could have turned his life around, or he could be working with the police. But Fingers had no other options. He had to take the chance. He found a payphone in a small town and dialed Ray's number, his heart pounding in his chest. He let it ring several times, wondering if Ray would even answer. Finally, Ray picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice gruff. "Ray, it's Fingers," Fingers said, keeping his voice low. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Fingers? Is that really you? I thought you were locked up." "I was," Fingers said. "But I got out. I need your help." Ray hesitated for a moment. "What kind of help?" "I need a place to stay, some money, maybe a new identity," Fingers said. "I'm on the run from the cops." Ray sighed. "This is bad, Fingers. Really bad. The whole country is looking for you." "I know," Fingers said. "But I don't have anyone else to turn to. Can you help me or not?" Ray was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "All right, Fingers. I'll help you. But you owe me big time." Fingers felt a surge of relief. "Thank you, Ray. I won't forget this." Ray gave Fingers directions to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. He told him to wait there, and he would meet him later that night. Fingers followed Ray's instructions, his mind racing. He hoped that he hadn't made a mistake. He was putting his trust in a man he hadn't seen in years, a man who might have changed. But he had no other choice. He had to trust someone. He had to believe that Ray would come through for him. His freedom depended on it. He waited in the motel room, listening to every sound, wondering if it was Ray or the police who were coming to his door. He was gambling everything on this one connection to his past. The odds, as always, were stacked against him. Ray arrived at the motel late that night, his face obscured by the shadows. Fingers breathed a sigh of relief. For a moment, he had feared that Ray wouldn't show up, or worse, that he would bring the police with him. Ray slipped a key under the door. "Room 12, he whispered. "Be there in 10 minutes. Fingers did as he was told, his senses on high alert. He slipped out of his room and made his way to room 12, knocking softly on the door. Ray opened the door, his eyes darting nervously around the parking lot. He ushered Fingers inside, quickly closing and locking the door behind him. "I got you some supplies," Ray said, gesturing to a bag on the bed. "Clothes, some cash, a map. It's not much, but it's all I could manage." Fingers thanked him, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe he had been wrong about Ray. Maybe he could trust him after all. They talked for a few minutes, catching up on old times. Ray seemed genuinely concerned about Fingers' well-being, offering him words of encouragement and advice. "You need to get out of the country, Fingers," Ray said. "That's your only chance. Go to Mexico, South America, somewhere they won't extradite you." Fingers nodded, agreeing with Ray's assessment. He had already been thinking about heading south. Ray stood up to leave. "I gotta go," he said. "I can't be seen with you. It's too risky." Fingers thanked him again, shaking his hand warmly. "I owe you one, Ray," he said. "I won't forget this." Ray smiled sadly. "Just stay safe, Fingers. And try not to get caught." Ray left the motel room, disappearing into the night. Fingers felt a sense of gratitude, but also a nagging feeling of unease. Something didn't feel right. He rummaged through the bag Ray had given him, checking the supplies. The clothes were cheap and ill-fitting, the cash was barely enough to buy a bus ticket, and the map was outdated. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ray was holding something back. He had seemed too eager to help, too concerned about Finger's safety. It didn't add up. Then, he saw it. Tucked beneath the map, he found a small, electronic device, a GPS tracker. Finger's blood ran cold. He realized what Ray had done. He had set him up. The reward money must have been too tempting. Ray had betrayed him, selling him out to the police. Fingers ripped the GPS tracker from the map and smashed it against the wall, his face contorted with rage. He had been a fool to trust Ray. He should have known better. He knew that the police would be arriving soon. He had to get out of the motel room, and fast. He grabbed his backpack and headed for the back door, his mind racing, trying to figure out his next move. He had been betrayed. Now he was truly alone. His last thread of hope had been cut. Fingers burst out of the motel room and into the darkness, his senses on high alert. He knew that the police would be converging on the motel from all directions. He had to find a way to escape, to disappear once again. He ran through the parking lot, dodging cars, heading for the woods on the other side. He could hear the sirens wailing in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. He reached the woods and plunged into the undergrowth, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he couldn't outrun the police forever. They would be searching the woods with dogs and helicopters. He had to find a place to hide, to wait for the heat to die down. He stumbled through the darkness, his clothes torn, his body aching. He finally came to a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees. He crouched down behind a fallen log, trying to catch his breath. Suddenly, he heard a voice. "Don't move. Police. You are surrounded." Fingers froze. He looked up and saw a dozen police officers, their guns drawn, pointing at him. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run. He raised his hands in the air, surrendering. He knew that it was over. He had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered. His freedom had been short-lived. "Get on the ground," the officer shouted. "Face down. Hands behind your back." Fingers obeyed, lying face down on the cold, damp ground. He could feel the officer's boots pressing down on his back, the cold steel of the handcuffs closing around his wrists. He was caught. He had lost. The rope to freedom had snapped. The police officers pulled him to his feet, their faces grim. They led him out of the woods, towards the waiting patrol cars. As he walked, he saw Captain Reynolds standing near one of the cars, his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. "Well, Fingers," Reynolds said, "looks like your little game is over." Fingers didn't say anything. He knew that there was nothing he could say. He had been defeated. They put him in the back of a patrol car, and he watched as the motel receded into the distance. He knew that he would be going back to Ironwood Penitentiary, and this time, there would be no escape. He had reached the end of the line. All that was left was to face the consequences of his actions. The dream of freedom had died. The ride back to Ironwood was silent and uneventful. Fingers stared out the window, watching the landscape blur by. He was no longer a ghost, a shadow. He was just another prisoner, returning to his cage. He thought about his escape, about the meticulous planning, the daring execution, the brief taste of freedom. He had come so close, only to have it all snatched away. He had been a fool to trust Ray. He should have known that no one could be trusted in this world. Everyone was looking out for themselves, willing to betray anyone for a few dollars. But he couldn't blame Ray entirely. He had made his own choices, taken his own risks. He had known the consequences, and he had been willing to accept them. Now, it was time to face those consequences. He knew that he would be punished severely for his escape. He would likely spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement. He would never see the outside world again. But as the patrol car pulled up to the gates of Ironwood Penitentiary, Fingers felt a strange sense of peace. The chase was over. The running was done. He could finally rest. He stepped out of the car and walked towards the prison, his head held high. He was no longer fighting, no longer resisting. He had accepted his fate. The guards led him through the familiar corridors, past the cells, past the laundry room, past the admin office. He saw the faces of the other inmates, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and admiration. He reached his old cell, the one he had so meticulously planned his escape from. He stepped inside and sat down on his bunk. It felt like he had never left. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was home. He knew that his life would be difficult from now on. But he was ready. He had survived Ironwood once, and he would survive it again. He was Fingers, and he was a survivor. He had lost the battle, but he hadn't lost the war. He would never give up hope. He would always dream of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, one day, he would find a way to escape again. But for now, he would wait. He would observe. He would plan. He would survive. He was back in his cage, but his mind was still free. And that was all that mattered. He was Fingers. He had surrendered, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. The days that followed were long and monotonous. Fingers was placed in solitary confinement, his only contact with the outside world coming through the narrow slot in his cell door. He was allowed 1 hour of exercise per day, in a small, enclosed yard. He spent his time reflecting on his brief taste of freedom. He thought about the open road, the fresh air, the feeling of being in control of his own destiny. He had only had a few weeks of freedom, but it was enough to remind him of what he was missing. He also thought about the consequences of his actions. He had broken the law, betrayed the trust of the prison officials, and put other people at risk. He had hurt his family, his friends, and himself. He knew that he deserved to be punished. He had made his choices, and he had to face the consequences. But he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. Had the brief taste of freedom been worth the years of solitary confinement? Had the thrill of the escape been worth the pain and suffering he had caused? He didn't know the answer. Maybe there was no right or wrong answer. Maybe it was just a matter of perspective. He thought about Guard Miller, the young, inexperienced guard who had been fooled by his forgery. He wondered what had happened to him. Had he been reprimanded? Had he lost his job? He felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone. He had just wanted to escape, to be free. But his actions had had unintended consequences. He thought about Ray, his former associate who had betrayed him. He felt a mixture of anger and disappointment. He had trusted Ray, and Ray had let him down. But he couldn't blame Ray entirely. He had made his own choices. He had known that Ray was a criminal, and he had taken the risk of trusting him. He realized that the only person he could truly trust was himself. He had to rely on his own wits, his own instincts, his own skills. He couldn't depend on anyone else. He spent hours in his cell, exercising his mind, solving puzzles, reading books. He refused to let his mind atrophy. He had to stay sharp, stay focused. He had to be ready for anything. He knew that he might never escape from Ironwood again. But he would never give up hope. He would always dream of freedom. And he would always be ready to seize any opportunity that came his way. He was Fingers, and he was a survivor. He would endure. He would overcome. He would never be truly broken. He was a survivor. He was Fingers. He would continue to observe, and to plan. Years passed. Fingers remained in Ironwood, a model prisoner. He kept to himself, followed the rules, and caused no trouble. He spent his time reading, studying, and exercising his mind. Some of the guards believed that he had finally given up, that his spirit had been broken. But Captain Reynolds knew better. He knew that Fingers was always planning, always scheming. He kept a close watch on him, never letting his guard down. Rumors began to circulate among the inmates. Some said that Fingers was using his forgery skills to help other prisoners obtain fake IDs and documents, assisting them in their own escapes. Others said that he was working with the prison authorities, providing them with information about inmate activities in exchange for leniency. The truth was more complicated. Fingers had indeed been approached by both sides. Some inmates had begged him to help them, offering him money and favors in exchange for his skills. The prison authorities had offered him a deal: if he would help them maintain order, they would reduce his sentence and grant him certain privileges. Fingers had refused both offers. He had learned his lesson about trust. He wouldn't risk his freedom, or his conscience, for anyone else. But he hadn't stopped using his skills. He was still observing, still planning. He was just waiting for the right opportunity. One day, a new warden arrived at Ironwood. He was a progressive, forward-thinking man who believed in rehabilitation and redemption. He had heard about Fingers' story, about his intelligence, his resourcefulness, his artistic talent. He decided to meet with Fingers, to see if there was any way to harness his skills for good. He offered Fingers a deal: if he would agree to teach other inmates valuable skills, such as handwriting analysis and document authentication, he would be granted a reduced sentence and a chance at parole. Fingers considered the offer carefully. It was a tempting proposition. It would give him a chance to use his skills for good, to help other people turn their lives around. But it would also mean betraying his own principles, cooperating with the system that had imprisoned him. He finally made his decision. He accepted the warden's offer, but with one condition: he would only teach inmates who were genuinely remorseful for their crimes and committed to changing their ways. The warden agreed, and Fingers began his new life as a teacher. He taught inmates how to analyze documents, detect forgeries, and authenticate signatures. He shared his knowledge, his experience, and his wisdom. Some of his students went on to become successful document examiners, working for law enforcement agencies and private companies. Others used their skills to protect themselves from fraud and scams. Fingers had found a way to use his talents for good, to make a positive contribution to the world. He had finally found redemption. But deep down, a part of him still yearned for freedom. He still dreamed of escaping from Ironwood, of seeing the world outside of prison walls. He knew that one day, he might have another opportunity. And if that day ever came, he would be ready. He was still Fingers, and he was still a survivor. And maybe, just maybe, the rope to freedom would appear again. Or perhaps, his redemption would be his true escape. The choice, as always, was his.